On January 6, 1941, President Roosevelt gave his annual message to Congress. It's a significant day because the president was actually propped up so he would be seen standing before Congress. It was the first time the annual message to Congress, what we call the State of the Union, it was the first time it had ever been filmed. It wasn't televised till later when Truman was president. So the president was propped up January 6, 1941 for his annual message to Congress, had just been reelected an unprecedented third time the previous November. And of course went on and was elected a fourth term later. President Roosevelt was reelected because he ran on he would not get us in the war, even though he desperately wanted to help our allies. Roosevelt and Churchill had a close friendship that had been going on for years, and Roosevelt so wanted to help Great Britain, but ran on a platform of I won't get us in the war. Of course, we were in the war by late in 41 when Pearl Harbor was bombed. But on this January 6th message, he talked about why the United States should be in the war. Because too many freedoms around the world were in jeopardy. The president and Churchill even signed a pact later that year out in the Atlantic called the Atlantic Pact, talking about the 4 freedoms that need to be saved for all the world. Norman Rockwell was such a well-known illustrator at the time, and he loved the message from the president. And that notion of these 4 freedoms he really liked. So after we were in the war, Rockwell and all Americans thought of what they could do to help the war. And Rockwell wanted to paint some paintings that might help take the message of those 4 freedoms forward. He wrestled with it for months and finally came up with a notion on an image for each of these 4 freedoms. And so he did these paintings, took them to Washington, could get very little interest. And he came back, he was headed back to his home in Vermont, stopped at the Saturday Evening Post headquarters in Philadelphia. They loved the notion of these paintings he had done, said they would run a small poster in 4 editions of the magazine supporting it. As soon as that happened, there was so much support, the War Department changed their mind. Oh, we want to do large posters. We want to get the notion of supporting these freedoms out to all Americans. And so the War Department published these huge posters. They're printed on the bottom, published by the Office of War Information. And the original paintings went on a 14-city tour around the country in late 43 and 44, early 44. They sold $132 million of war bonds on this 4 Freedoms tour. And if you bought a war bond, you got a small little print of each of these 4. I have a set of those, and I've got a set that he signed on one. He only went to 2 of the venues. But the paintings are so powerful. So I want to tell you about them and the message behind them. The first freedom was freedom of speech. Rockwell had actually attended a town meeting in Arlington, Vermont, where he lived, where they were having a meeting about building a new school. And this one guy, Carl Hess, is standing up at the meeting. It was in the town hall in Arlington, Vermont. I've been there. Carl Hess had the freedom to stand up and oppose the new school they wanted to build. And if you look at everybody else in the crowd, they are listening. He is free to speak. And if you look at Carl, look at his hand. He's a working man. Look at it, the grease on the sleeve of his jacket. He's different than most of the people in the painting, but he had the freedom to speak. And it's a freedom that much of the world didn't have during the war at that time. The significance too is Norman painted himself into this painting. This is freedom of worship. And Roosevelt and Churchill talked about how too much of the world wasn't free to worship as they choose. It's significant. It's not freedom of religion, but freedom of worship. And Rockwell wanted to paint as many faiths and nationalities as he could into this painting. And if you'll notice, there's not a lot of color. He wanted to minimize those differences among the various faiths and nationalities. And it's kind of interesting to note this lady's in 2 of the paintings we'll talk about. At the time of these paintings, so much of the world was dealing with crisis. You know, in London, the whole town was dark to avoid the bombings at night. And in the US, that was even happening. And this particular freedom from fear was so significant. Over half the world at the time wasn't free from fear. Rockwell had the local newspaper mock up a headline about the bombings overseas. And yet this couple is tucking their kids in without a care in the world. A friend of mine asked about the doll on the ground. The little girl didn't have to have her doll to go to sleep. She wasn't afraid. And despite the headlines, the lights are on downstairs. You can see, even outside, the street lights are on. You can see the reflection in the glass. This probably was the most impactful of the four freedoms images that Rockwell did. This last image, freedom from want, was the most difficult because so many people in the world were hungry and starving, and yet America was still bountiful in a way by painting this Thanksgiving scene. But it was one of the four freedoms that President Roosevelt talked about, and it's a traditional Thanksgiving scene. The incredible thing about it, this is just a poster. If you could see this original painting, you can see that there's a clear glass and clear ice on a white tablecloth, and yet there's still a shadow. There are 21 colors of white in this painting. If you ever see the original, you can just about pick up the celery. The fun thing too is Rockwell painted his wife and his mother into this across the table from each other. And this guy, Jim Martin, is in all four paintings.